Welcome to Bad Ideas, the show where we look at misfires, mistakes, and miscalculations from all throughout history.
I'm Tony Southcott.
And I'm Albert Berg, and today's episode is brought to you by our featured patron, Susan8787.
She was our featured patron last week.
That's not a mistake at all. She's just amazing.
She is.
I definitely didn't forget to cross her out on the list, and I'm not going to edit this out, Tony.
That's okay. Sometimes bad ideas extend into the show.
Today we're going to talk about the charge of the Light Brigade. Tony, does that ring any bells at all for you?
I definitely heard this, but I've never actually done anything with it. Like I've never researched it. I don't know what it is. It sounds like a cavalry charge that went wrong, but I don't know.
Do you know why the words all in together, the charge of the Light Brigade, are recognizable?
I do not.
They are the title of a poem, which was written after the event that we're going to talk about. If you are familiar at all with the charge of the Light Brigade, it's very likely that you're familiar mostly with that poem and probably not a lot else. If you had a decent English teacher, they might have told you the basis of the poem, that there was a failed cavalry charge, as Tony intuited earlier in the show. But you probably don't know the deeper history, and that is what we're going to be talking about today, Tony. The Crimean War is the setting. The Crimean War is one of those wars that, as Americans, I don't think we hear enough about, but it was a pretty major event in the history of the 1800s. This is Russia essentially trying to expand into Turkey. They have some baked up reason about there's some religious sites there they want to quote unquote protect, and the British see them doing that and say, that's not that cool, and France sees them doing that and says, that's not that cool. So France, England, and Turkey all team up together into a big allied group to fight off the Russians, and they make their initial stab at repulsing the Russians from this area in a place around a fort called Sevastopol. There's a city and a fort in this area called Sevastopol, and the English decide that that's where they want to strike their first battle. It doesn't go that well. They get to the shore where they had originally planned to disembark. They figure out that there's not a good harbor there. Like, they can get their men ashore, but they can't really bring ships in that can get supplies to the men. So they have this initial disembarkation. They meet with some Russian forces. They win in their first battle against the Russian forces, but the Russians are able to retreat because the English don't capitalize on their initial victory, and the Russians are now holed up in Sevastopol. The English and French and Turks all kind of eventually make their way over to the other side of the peninsula where they'd landed and find some port cities to hole up in. And the English end up with the worst of the port cities, a place called Balaclava. And it's the worst because it's on the flank and it's relatively exposed. So the English forces are there and they're all kind of waiting to attack. The French in particular are requesting and demanding that they break up Sevastopol with a bunch of artillery fire before they actually launch an assault with their men.
Sounds like a solid plan.
You would think, but what it actually does is, because it takes them so long to get the artillery in place, they just give the Russians a bunch of time to build more fortifications and dig themselves in deeper. And in the meantime, the Russians decide to do a counterattack, and they counterattack at this place called Balaclava. If you've ever worn a balaclava and you wondered why it was called a balaclava, it's because of the city in the Crimea where these guys are freezing their butts off, and so they invent this, or possibly borrow a headpiece that's already existing to keep their mouths and their noses warm because, Russia, cold. So the Russians attack. And this is in around 1854. The Russians attack the Balaclava side of the forces that have come to attack them. The English forces primarily are here. There's also some Turks involved in this battle, some Ottomans. And if you're familiar with the phrase, the old sick man of Europe, that is referring to Turkey at this time. That everybody's kind of propping up Turkey because they want to maintain the status quo more or less. The Turkish are providing some of their own forces, but in this battle, they're going to be either less than effective or not well coordinated with the English. It's difficult to tell whether they got kind of hung out to dry or whether they were not as heavy as they could have been, or both. I'm sure a more prominent actual historian type person could tell you that. I don't have that information to say definitively, Tony. But what happens is the Russians attack. There are some heights, some ridges, if you will, a series of hills that they are attacking, and the Turkish people, the forces from the Turks, are defending these heights, and they are eventually overrun. The Battle of Balaclava, if it ended at a certain point in the day, would have been like a smashing success for the Britons, because they have two major victories. They have the Thin Red Line, which is a Russian charge that comes up against a row of English soldiers that's only 2 men deep. And the English soldiers are able to fight off the Russian charge successfully.
Surprising with how much depth there to be able to stop cavalry like that.
Yes. There's some of the sources I read indicated that maybe it was because they weren't particularly worried about the Russians, that they probably should have been formed up in like a square where it would have been more difficult to attack. So maybe some hubris that kind of pays off. But it worked, so who am I to judge one way or the other? And then the charge of the Heavy Brigade is another big successful moment that the British have here, where there's this one of these cavalry units that's moving around. They encounter some Russian forces. They happen to be able to attack, and they take advantage of that attack, and they smash like 4 times as many guys as they have. It's a 500-man force. They go up against 2,000, and they're victorious. So at the beginning of the day, things are looking great if you're a Briton, and you kind of just wish that they'd stopped writing the history right there. Because what happens is the Russians decide they're going to make the best of the situation as it stands. And as I mentioned earlier, they had overrun these heights. There are these little fortifications called redoubts on these heights. R-E-D-O-U-B-T, like re and then doubt, like I doubt that you're telling the truth. And this would essentially have been a small fortification where you would have artillery set up. It's got some earthenworks or stonework walls to protect your guys from being shot at directly, but it's not heavily fortified. It's not like a major fortress. And they've captured these things from the Turks. So what they are doing now is they've got the guns of the Allied forces, and they say, well, things aren't going great for us, but hey, we've got this stuff. Let's retreat with these guns. Let's take these away. Now, the commander of the British forces at the Battle of Balaclava is Lord Ragland. And Ragland is situated on a hill overlooking the whole battlefield, and he can see the Russians starting to move away with the guns. And it's worth noting that throughout this battle, Ragland's leadership has been less than stellar from what I can tell. He's in charge of a lot of the stuff in the landing that didn't go that well. So the stuff we mentioned earlier where they landed and they didn't have a harbor and they didn't pursue when they really could have probably smashed the troops up. He's playing politics with the French, which might be some of it, but also a lot of the orders that he gives are somewhat vague. And he talks about things being to the left and to the right, and that's obviously confusing from the perspective of anybody who's ever gotten directions from someone who's looking down on them from a hill saying, go left. And you're like, wait, who's left? Yours or mine?
Stage left?
Yes. Yeah. And so he sends orders down the line to Lord Lucan. Lord Lucan is the guy who's generally over all of the cavalry stuff. So he's got heavy brigades, light brigades, he's got all that stuff under him. And he says to Lord Lucan, hey, watch out, they're getting our guns, they're leaving. But he says it in like a really vague way. And Lucan isn't able to see what Lord Ragland can see. So Lucan is like, what? Where? Who? And he gives these orders to advance, but he says something about the infantry also advancing with the cavalry. So Lucan says, okay, well, I'm just going to hang out until the infantry's here then, because I'm not going by myself if the order is said to go with the infantry. And Raglan, meanwhile, is up on the hill, like jumping up and down, looking through his binoculars as the guns are getting away, saying, go get the guns. They're going to get the guns, and I don't want them to get the guns. Go away. Don't. Ah! He's like freaking out. So he sends another message. He follows up his first confusing message with another confusing message. And he sends it with a man named Nolan. Now, Luis or Lewis, I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce it. I think some of his British buds pronounced it Lewis, so we'll go with that. This man, Lewis Nolan, is a major fan of the cavalry as a military unit. And when I say a major fan, I mean he wrote 2 books on the subject. He invented a saddle that was in use and was named after him at this time in the British cavalry. It was called the Nolan Saddle informally. He was investigating like which types of horses could be used best for cavalry. This man is all in on cavalry use and understands cavalry tactics and believes that this is the actual future of warfare. Guys riding around on horses and slashing people with swords. In 100 years, that's where warfare is going to be, Tony. That's
where warfare has been for a few thousand years.
Well, and we talked, for those of you who aren't clear on the difference between Light Brigade and Heavy Brigade, because we mentioned both of those in this episode so far. Heavy Brigade would be guys who would ride in on horses, but then they would get off the horses mostly and start slashing on foot. So they're relatively mobile, but they can have heavier weapons that you can sort of wield two-handed or don't have to worry about balancing well with. A Light Brigade, they have lighter swords. They would ride in and slash and chop from the horses, but they don't have, as the name would imply, as heavy of an armament as the Heavy Brigade would.
Yeah, which is very important against certain types of armor that you're able to use, like a halberd or something like that.
Or just a thicker sword.
Yeah, thicker sword, like a broadsword, something like that. It's important to be able to like actually hack through instead of just like make quick slashes and try to and hope for the best.
So we have this man, Lewis Nolan, who is coming down with orders from General Raglan to Lucan. And he has the written orders in his hand. Now, I want to preface this by saying we cannot know what was in Lewis Nolan's head. But we're going to pretend like we can, Tony. I just want everybody to know up front, to make this story good, we're going to pretend that we know what Lewis Nolan was thinking. Because what Lewis Nolan was thinking was, man, these guys haven't been used enough. I'm so annoyed. I know all about cavalry. If I can just tell, if we just had more cavalry forces involved in this battle, it would be going so much better, and I'm going to prove it. And so he goes down to Lord Lucan, who's in charge of all the cavalry, and he says, hey, the general has this order for you to get the guns and stop the enemy from retreating. And he's very vague with this already relatively vague order, and he refuses to hand the paper order over to Lord Lucan.
That's not suspect at all.
Lucan is understandably kind of annoyed and angry at Lewis for doing this thing. He says, hey, Nolan, dude, I don't understand what you're doing. What guns are we talking about? Because remember, he can't see the retreating guns. What enemy? Who am I supposed to be attacking? And Nolan points. And instead of pointing up at the heights, he points down the North Valley area of Balaclava, where this battle takes place, directly into the jaws of the entrenched Russian army, and says, quote, there, my lord, is your enemy. There are your guns. And essentially tells this guy, oh, yeah, Lord Ragland, he wants you to charge into the mouth of the artillery. And so Lucan...
So he's pulling, like, for people that haven't done a lot of history, this is like in the third Lord of the Rings movie, whatever. It's just like, oh, just go charge the city. It's your duty.
Yes. I mean, ultimately,
Poor Faramir.
that's probably based on this, right? That Lord of the Rings charge, because this is so, like, important and pivotal in English history. There is no way that that's not really direct
I'm sure
reference.
Tolkien knew very well, like, about what happened there.
I don't know. I don't know the Lord of the Rings well enough to know if there is a Nolan type character though that's deliberately misrepresenting the general's orders to get the cavalry to prove him right about how great cavalry is.
No, this was more the Steward of Gondor having a lot of ego, thinking that they would just win because it's his son and his people doing the charge.
So Lucan is understandably confused by this, but he doesn't have to go, right? And the person who does have to go, though, is a man named Cardigan. And in another bit of sort of delightful character work, you can, in some of these stories, you can almost see the writing. It's like somebody was banging this out as a great novel, and they had like, oh man, what if these two guys were posed against each other and they have this beef? Cardigan and Lucan are related by marriage. Lucan has married Cardigan's sister, and Cardigan believes that he has good reason to believe that Lucan is being an abusive husband to his sister. So these guys hate each other. Cardigan hates Lucan. Lucan hates Cardigan. Cardigan, by the way, has just rolled up to the battle from his luxury yacht. This is legitimately true. He has this morning woken up on his luxury yacht, gotten off on the docks, and sort of sauntered up to the battle and said, well, what are we doing today, guys? And now Lucan is there in his face saying, yeah, Ragland wants you to charge into the mouth of the enemy and their cannons. And yeah, that's the order. And Cardigan says, and I will quote, allow me to point out to you that there is a battery in front, battery on each flank, and the ground is covered with Russian riflemen, end quote. And that's a quote from a book. And I don't know this for a fact, Tony, but if I was sort of imagining this in the theater of the mind, I would imagine that maybe that quote as it is written is probably cleaned up a little bit from the, are you insane? Are you like literally insane, my dude? I know that we aren't on good terms and stuff, but I'm gonna die. Like, that's a bad idea. That's what the show's about, Tony. It's about bad ideas, and this guy knows it.
It very much is.
And Lucan's response...
He was trying to prevent a podcast so many years later.
That jerk. Can you believe it? And his luxury yacht trying to stop us from having good material. He says, Lucan replies and says, I know it, but Lord Raglan will have it. We have no choice but to obey. And so...
I'm really hoping this guy gets hung for this later.
The Light Brigade charges right into the mouth of the cannon fire, and the result is almost as predictable as you would imagine. The one thing that you might not think in your head ahead of time, oh, this is how it's going to go, is that Lewis Nolan, as the Light Brigade is riding out and charging into this impossible cannonade, comes galloping up next to this charging force of men, past all the soldiers, past Lord Cardigan, and gets in front of all of these people charging into the mouth of these cannons. Now, there's two ways of interpreting this that I've read. One of them, the one that's charitable to Nolan, is that the thing we said earlier, as we mentioned, what could have been made up, that wasn't true, and that he realized, oh my goodness, I pointed in the wrong direction. No, don't go that way. And he's trying to get out in front of them to stop them. But the one that fits with our story, and the one that Lord Cardigan said later, was that the idea that Nolan is actually trying to take charge of this charge. He is trying to take credit. He's trying to be the guy who leads the charge. That he's the one who told him to do this. He's essentially usurped the orders from the general, and now he's going to usurp the command from this guy Cardigan, who is not, supposed to be in charge of this unit. And Cardigan is pissed, but he doesn't have a person to be pissed at for very long, because Nolan just gets killed. Like, he's one of the first persons who dies in this charge.
That's what happens when you walk into a kill box. Like, you can't have a more clearly, like, this is where everyone dies, like, section. You could have spray painted it, like, the exact square where everyone would die.
Yeah, and especially like, who should we shoot at? Let's shoot at the one guy who's way out in front of all of the other guys. And
is probably dressed as an officer, so he's a high-value target.
Correct. Or an aide de camp, I think is what he was. I couldn't get exactly, like, he wasn't exactly high-ranking, but he was working with the high-ranking guys.
I'm just trying to figure out, like, say this works. You're still possibly facing treason and various other things for completely disobeying orders, for putting troops in harm's way. It's going on a lot of faith that they're just going to be happy that you completely put all these people at risk.
Like I said, Tony, we legitimately can't know his inner thoughts. So maybe he didn't think of that. Maybe he thought, hey, we've won 2 battles already today. Let's make it an even 3. 3's a good number for, like, good wins. And again, if you pull it off, maybe legitimately you can say, hey, look, we won. It worked, didn't it? You know, I was just improvising in the heat of battle. That guy Lucan didn't really understand your command, Lord Raglan, and I was the only one really who was able to pull this out with the power of cavalry, which is amazing, by the way, and you should use it more often. I'm Lewis Nolan. He could have pulled something like that, but he's killed, right? And so are, let's read through the statistics here, 118 men, 335 horses, 127 men were wounded, and 60 of them were taken prisoner in this charge into the kill box.
I'm sure that's a great time to be a prisoner.
Cardigan, for his part, actually makes it all the way up to the Russian forces. This charge is quote-unquote successful. Like, they do get some guys up there to do some hacking and slashing. So Cardigan just full tilt, not even realizing that the guys behind him are all getting slaughtered because he can't see them, right? He's out in front. He gets there, he does his little bit of hacking and slashing. The Russians have a prisoner order on him. Like, they're like, don't kill that guy. Like, get him for a prisoner. But he manages to get away, doesn't organize a retreat of any kind, just books it back to the front lines until he sees somebody watching him, and then, like, pulls his horse back, and he's like, I'm just doing this very orderly, walking back our retreat. This is me. I've been doing this the whole time. I've just been riding normally, as I always would. It definitely...
Because cool guys don't run in terror.
Definitely not. And so he gets away from the battle unscathed, goes back to his luxury yacht, and just chills for whatever is remaining of this day. Now, he doesn't get hanged, Tony. He has to get called in front of a court to sort of answer for, like, okay, what happened? Who's at fault here? And they never really come down on anybody. He is in the camp of, hey, that guy Lewis Nolan, he said bad stuff. I don't know what you want from me. He tried to charge in front of all of my guys who were coming after trying to do this really stupid order that Lewis Nolan came up with. It's entirely possible that Lewis Nolan is just the scapegoat for all of these guys being idiots. And since he died, he's not there to defend himself, Tony.
Yeah, it does seem like there could definitely be that. If he's trying to run out in front of all the entire charge, he might have been trying to stop it.
You're welcome to take that position, Tony. But regardless, I think the bad idea here is just a general failure to communicate. I think whether or not Lewis Nolan intentionally misrepresented the general's orders, Ragland definitely still has some responsibility here. The guy who's in charge is supposed to be making his will clear to the people who are under him. And it's evident from my reading of this story that he did not do an adequate job of this. And as a result, the British forces take a loss that is going to demoralize them, essentially, not into a loss of the entire war, because they do eventually win, but it really sets them back a few months, I want to say, trying to put back together what they have lost in this charge. The charge of the Light Brigade is such a blow to the British sort of big, boastful, we're awesome, the sun never sets on us. I mean, this is sort of the prime of Victorian British colonial era, and for them to have this kind of a defeat is utterly devastating. I mean, there's a reason why the poet laureate, or whatever title he had at the time, the official poet of Britain at the time, was commissioned to write a poem about this, because it impacted so many people so heavily that it sort of just sunk into the national psyche. It was a failure to literally go down in the history books, Tony. And that's why we're talking about it.
That is indeed a very bad idea.
That is all we have for this episode on the Charge of the Light Brigade. I hope that you learned something. If you were familiar with it at all before, I hope that we have deepened your knowledge. If we got something wrong, and it's entirely possible that we did, either through ignorance or laziness, we would love for you to send us a message or leave a comment on the YouTube video if you would like to correct us. We are open to that. And yeah, we will see you guys next week with another episode of Bad Ideas.